It's Adam here for PC Monitors, and this is a quick review of the ASUS ROG Swift OLED PG49WCD. As usual for video, what you see depends on my camera, depends on the processing done by my video editing software, by YouTube, and ultimately, and very importantly, depends on the screen that you're viewing the video on, so it doesn't accurately represent what you'd see firsthand using the monitor. If you prefer more technical details, there is a full video review, and there's a link to that in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do. Be aware that liking the video, subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, they're nice ways of showing your support. This monitor uses a Samsung Display QD OLED panel, which is 49 inches and has a 5120 by 1440 resolution. So that's 32 by 9, or rounded to 32 by 9, so-called super ultra wide. Also supports a 144Hz refresh rate. So there's a huge amount of desktop real estate horizontally. It's actually like having two 27-inch 16 by 9 1440p models next to each other, or QHD models next to each other. It could be particularly useful for multitasking horizontally, or tasks such as video editing, where you can have a nice long timeline and see it all at the same time. In terms of the overall clarity, it has the same sort of pixel density as a 27-inch QHD or 1440p model, 2560 by 1440 resolution. And it has a glossy screen surface, which I'll explore a little bit more later, which also helps. But as this image shows, the subpixels have an unusual layout, so they're not the usual red, green and blue stripe, although it is an RGB arrangement still. You can see they're arranged in this little weird triad pattern. On the left, you can see what it looks like with the first generation QD OLED panels. That's used on the 34-inch models. This 49-inch model has a second generation QD OLED panel, and the arrangement is a little bit different because it has more of a rectangular look to the subpixels rather than a weird blob. So there are some fringing issues to be aware of, and they're explored on an article all about this topic, and that is linked to in the description of the video. It's also explored in a bit more detail in the full video review. But all I'm going to say about it here is they have at least improved the fringing. It's significantly reduced. It was something which was widely reported on the 34-inch models. It is still there in the same kind of places on this model, but the fringe is much thinner and more difficult to notice. So a few other features to note on this monitor. It has KVM support, it has USB-C with 90 watts of power delivery. It also includes HDMI 2.1, and that includes HDMI 2.1 VRR support, and it's full bandwidth HDMI 2.1, so 48 gigabits per second. It also has a 4K UHD downsampling mode, which is useful for games consoles, and you can use that at up to 120 Hz. Just be aware that the scaling mode for 16 by 9 on this monitor can't be used when VRR is active at the same time, but as usual for ultra-wides and super ultra-wides, really it's designed more for PC use, and console use should really just be a secondary consideration. And speaking of PC use, the screen is very immersive indeed. You'll also be able to see what looks like a pincushion effect in the middle. That's because the screen is curved. It doesn't look like this to the eye at all. It's actually a far more gentle looking curve to the eye. It's a very wide screen, and the curve isn't super steep or anything, so you don't get this kind of effect, and it's something which is natural. You should adapt to very quickly. Not all games support the resolution, but quite a few I tested do. So Cyberpunk was fine, Battlefield titles were fine as well, Shadow of the Tomb Raider, a bit of an older title, that was also fine. Starfield, not fine, but that could be updated with a patch. That title did support 21 by 9 though, so it filled up most of the screen. I've just loaded up Shadow of the Tomb Raider just so I can show you the difference between 32 by 9 and 16 by 9 with a nice little example here. So this is 32 by 9, really expansive horizontal field of view. This is 16 by 9. So same field of view vertically, but a lot less horizontally. I'm on Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and I'm going to talk about the contrast performance of the monitor. I'm using a different lens on the camera because this one is more focused on detail, and that certainly helps when I'm talking about contrast. So the monitor has an infinite contrast ratio, as usual for OLEDs. Black is pure black, and it also has per pixel illumination. It doesn't rely on a backlight, so it can have some pixels very bright and others very dark right next to each other. No backlight bleed to worry about, no IPS glow or VA glow or any sort of glow, just exceptional depth and atmosphere. Some people will talk about black crush on OLEDs. I don't really like that term. It can be used to describe VAs because they have a huge mass in the centre of the screen, or a cone, which is more blended for dark shades, unless the gamma is calibrated such that that is offset a lot, and then you get issues peripherally instead, where things are too washed out. Anyway, this monitor doesn't have that issue. It has very consistent gamma, good 2.2 gamma handling, and the 2.2 gamma curve isn't designed to really lift out dark details a super amount. They are reasonably well blended, and that is the case on this monitor. Yes, there might be a little bit of extra blending compared to what you might expect on a monitor with infinite contrast and perfect 2.2 gamma handling. So actually the level of detail, seeing the little bones, little skulls on the sides there, they are brought out in a way which they just aren't on LCD monitors. And even the medium shades have extra depth to them because of the excellent contrast. LCDs in comparison can give a little bit of a translucent quality to some shades, whereas they look far more solid in this case. The gamma consistency is also exceptional, so I was kind of alluding to that earlier, but these detail levels are maintained very well throughout the entire screen. The screen surface is glossy with an effective anti-glare treatment. And as usual for QD OLEDs, if there is direct light striking the surface, it does lighten up a bit, and that occurs when it's switched on as well as when it's off. So you might be able to see actually even in this lighting, the panel border is blacker than the rest of the screen, a bit of light in the room. With strong direct light striking the screen, it can take on a bit of a colourful tint as well. It can be purple or slightly reddish, really depends on the lighting. I've brightened the room up quite a bit just so you can see that sort of colourful tint with the screen surface, which can occur in brighter conditions. There is indeed some light striking the screen surface directly as well. It also allows you to see the reflections more clearly, and because of the curved nature of the screen, the reflections can stretch across the screen, and certainly if you're viewing it off angle, the stretched reflections can be rather significant. But in more controlled lighting conditions, it isn't something you should worry about. So with all this in mind, I've lightened the room up just to show you the monitor switched on with more light coming into the room. You may notice that the depth of the dark shade isn't as good, and there's actually a little bit of a blue tint. Sometimes you can see a kind of reddish or brown tint as well, depending on the lighting. That's not just because there's a glossy screen surface, it's also because QD OLEDs like this do not have an outer polarizing layer. So to get the most out of the monitor, you do want to be in controlled lighting conditions. It doesn't mean you have to be in a pitch black room, but certainly if the room's bright and if you have direct light striking the screen surface, then it does eat away at the depth and atmosphere. Most LCDs will have matte screen surfaces though, so that has a bit of different interaction with the light. You get diffused patches of light. And another nice thing about the glossy screen surface is there's no graininess when you're observing brighter shades, there's no layering in front of the image, nice direct emission of light. And just a quick note before moving on the brightness of the monitor. So under SDR, you can get it up to around 260 nits or down to 15 nits. And it has a setting called uniform brightness, which will ensure that there isn't a heavy ABL, automatic brightness limiter, kicking in under SDR. You can disable that and it will go brighter, but it will also dim depending on the content. So for a more consistent experience, uniform brightness is definitely preferred. I know some people prefer brighter monitors, but for most people between 100 and 200 nits is the target for their brightness under SDR for regular usage, and that's certainly delivered here with a little bit of headroom beyond that. I'm now on Battlefield 2042, and I'm going to talk about the colour reproduction of the monitor. I'm using my ultra-wide lens as well so you can see the entirety of the monitor. I did enjoy the 32:9 experience on this game. I found a bit of a competitive edge actually, because it really engages your peripheral vision and you can see movement towards the edges of the screen, which you would miss on 16:9 or even 34:9 monitors. Anyway, back to the colour reproduction. Nice vibrant look to the sky. The game's running under SDR, and as such it's designed with the sRGB colour space in mind. That applies to most other content you'll be looking at, whether you're browsing the internet or watching SDR video content as well. It's designed with the sRGB colour space in mind. If you use a wider colour gamut than that on the monitor, then it invites extra saturation and extra vibrancy. So this is what the colour gamut on this model looks like using the full native wide gamut. 99% DCI-P3 and some extension beyond that. 96% Adobe RGB if you were interested. So a very generous gamut indeed, invites a lot of extra vibrancy, and combined with the glossy screen surface, there is definitely a vibrant look to things. So the fire there shows some really rich orangey reds and some strong yellow shades, but the yellows verge too much on orange, the orange is a bit too much on red, that kind of thing, because of the oversaturation. The sky blues are very eye-catching as well, too eye-catching really. And there aren't any good examples of greens here, but I noticed that green shades, forest vegetation, that kind of thing, it can look a little bit neon in places, just too bright really, some of the shades. Because of the generous gamut in the red region, some browns or slightly reddish browns, they take on a strong orangey red tint. If you prefer a more as the developers intend look, then there is indeed an option. There's an sRGB emulation setting, and the most flexible sRGB emulation setting on this monitor. The switch display color space over to sRGB. With that, it tones everything down nicely. Sky blue's more appropriate, fires are more toned down. Things certainly look decidedly less vibrant, and you won't be able to see the exact nature of the difference on the video, but you will be able to see hopefully a relative difference, relative decrease in saturation even from the video, but it just gets rid of the oversaturation. And with this mode, the gamut looks like this, 98% sRGB with no overcoverage to speak of. It's also a very flexible mode. You can adjust the color channels, gamma, brightness. It actually doesn't lock any of your controls off. It's the same as the wide gamut setting. If you prefer somewhere between the native wide gamut and this sRGB representation, there's also an option for that. You set color space to DCI-P3, although you also have to make sure that you've selected a color temperature. So see, I've got it set to user. That actually creates an sRGB emulation setting for some reason using DCI-P3, but if I select 6500K or something else, then it does emulate DCI-P3. And with this setting, this is what the gamut looks like. 96% DCI-P3 coverage, so a little bit of DCI-P3 coverage is lost compared to natively, but there's very little overextension beyond the gamut. So this isn't just about giving you a nice look to things, and it's a good flexibility to have. You might like different settings for different titles or different tasks, but it's also useful if you're using the monitor for content creation. As always, I would recommend for best results, do calibrate it using your own colorimeter or alternative device if you can, but it's still nice to have good flexibility with the emulation settings if you don't have access to a colorimeter or alternative device. It's also worth mentioning the colour consistency is exceptionally strong, just like I was saying with the gamma consistency with respect to contrast earlier, that applies to the colours. So the vibrancy is maintained very well indeed throughout the screen. So it doesn't matter if it's the centre or right at the edge or anywhere else on the screen, has the same sort of vibrant look or the same representation of the shade, whatever that might be. I'm on Shadow of the Tomb Raider and I'm running the game under HDR. The HDR modes of the monitor, they are explored in the best settings video and the OSD video, so I'm not going to go through them here. Just remember that my preference is the gaming HDR setting, but feel free to try the others. You might have your own preferences. There's also Display HDR 400 True Black that will provide a more consistent experience. And to help reinforce that, there is an HDR luminance graph I'm showing you here. The orange line shows the monitor using its HDR setting. It's gaming HDR, console HDR, cinema HDR, it doesn't matter. They perform very similarly in this test. The purple line shows Display HDR 400 True Black. So you can see that the purple line is more consistent, but with the orange line it peaks at 1031 nits, and that's for a 1% window. That means that there's a little block in the middle of the screen covering 1% of the pixels, and the other readings show 4%, 9%, 25%, 49%, 100%. 100% is a sustained reading, so that means the screen is showing full white for 30 seconds before the reading's taken. So in other words, as more bright shade is displayed on the screen, the monitor does dim. It has ABL, automatic brightness limiter behavior. That is entirely typical for OLEDs. It's a power limitation. And actually the behavior I'm seeing here is very similar indeed to the first generation QD OLED panels, such as the Dell Alienware AW3423DW, which I reviewed a little while back. So in practice, this does make for a very dynamic experience. So even in this scene here, I can see a lot of advantages to HDR. So there's a nice brightness here. It's not super bright, but it's not trying to be. The game's not going for its full brightness here, and the monitor's not going for its full brightness. But there's a nice look to that. The darker shades and the medium shades, there's actually a fine mixture of them here, and it's handled very well indeed by the monitor. The per pixel illumination does help there. And also the fact that 10-bit colour reproduction is used under HDR, which enhances the nuanced shade variety. So there is an excellent variety of very closely matching dark and medium dark shades. Really gives a nice natural uplift to detail, a really nice look. I'm on a scene on Battlefield 5, running under HDR again. And this scene is handled more impressively on mini LED solutions with very powerful backlights. And the reason for that is that the OLEDs, like this one, they have the automatic brightness limiter kicking in. So the sun there, for example, it does look really nice and bright if there aren't too many bright shades displayed. But even here, there is just a sufficient number of bright shades that the ABL kicks in. So it does dim things down a bit. There isn't the same kind of glint on the icy surfaces down there either. But if I look over here, for example, then yes, the per pixel illumination and the way it's handling the mixture of really medium and dark shades, the mixture of shades here is very nice. These highlights in this scene just aren't as impressive or eye-catching as they should be. Back on Shadow of the Tomb Raider, this scene is handled really nicely by this QD OLED panel. So there's a really lovely luminous look to the reflection there. And not only that, it doesn't just look pure white as it might appear on the video, it actually has a nice silvery purple rim to it, so really nice flashes of colour. And actually on WOLED panels, you don't get that because they have an unfiltered white subpixel, which is where they get their brightness from. And that means that they can't handle saturation and brightness at the same time. There's a high brightness, then there's low saturation. In other words, the color volume's bad. Whereas the QD OLED panels, like used here, they can maintain excellent color volume, so you can get saturation and brightness all at the same time. This is just an example of that. You can see it in spell effects and games very easily, that kind of thing. But it is nice, and the general OLED advantages as well with the per pixel illumination certainly apply. So you've got a really lovely variety of dark shades here, nice natural detail levels, and again the nuanced shade variety is helping as well. This scene overall is presented very nicely and much better than I've seen on any LCD and indeed LG OLED technology. And another scene on Shadow of the Tomb Raider which I like to use to talk about HDR. Very nice representation here, so the glint of light there has a nice look to it. It isn't quite as eye-catching as that other glint I showed you. That's partly because of the contrast, but also because there are more bright shades. So the automatic brightness limiter is kicking in a little bit here, but not anywhere near as heavily as it did on that Battlefield 5 mountain sun scene I showed you. So there's definitely still a really nice eye-catching look to the sun glint. The light streaming above looks nice and bright as well, and a 10-bit colour reproduction helps with the nuanced shade variety, smooth gradients, etc. It's all very nice. Over here, mixtures of dark and medium shades, and some of the dark shades, the shadow details, are really fine, but they're handled very nicely with the medium shades not dragged down, so it's not like local dimming solutions on mini LEDs where you get zonal control, where it just can't handle these kind of intricate mixtures. There are basically 7 million or so dimming zones on this monitor. Of course, the other aspect of HDR to consider is colour reproduction. Just to give you a reminder of the gamut, 99% DCI-P3. So it's a very generous gamut. There's also extension beyond DCI into Rec 2020. And under HDR, the game developers are targeting these wide colour gamuts, DCI-P3 and ultimately Rec 2020. It'd be lovely to have 100% Rec 2020 coverage, but that's not possible on any monitor so far. I mean, this one covers a decent amount of Rec 2020. The overall look is vibrant. They've mapped the gamut nicely as well to provide good vibrancy where it's warranted. So the greens here look nice and luscious, but they don't look overdone, they don't look neon. The same with the rocks here. They don't have this excessive coppery tone that they have under SDR. Lara's skin as well looks suitable. It doesn't look completely overdone, too tanned, too sun-kissed, anything like that. And even the water here, with the generous extension in the green to blue region of the gamut, there's a very nice deep look to some of these turquoise shades as well. So overall, really enjoyable HDR experience on this monitor. It is definitely a monitor where you're going to want to use HDR a lot of the time. Not necessarily all of the time, but certainly you're going to be wanting to make more use of it than on most monitors where HDR is a bit of an afterthought. Yes, it would be nice to have the lack of ABL or high sustained brightnesses where bright shades dominate, but that isn't something which is possible on any current OLED monitor technology. I'm back on Battlefield 5 and I'm going to look at the responsiveness of the monitor. This monitor has 144Hz refresh rate. I've got the game running 144 frames a second. That brings with it some advantages in terms of minimizing perceived blur. So there are two main forms of perceived blur. Part of it's due to eye movement, and that's closely linked to the refresh rate of the display. The rest of it is down to the pixel responses. So in terms of the refresh rate and the perceived blur due to eye movement, there's certainly a nice reduction in that, just because of the refresh rate alone and the frame rate. This combination also improves the connected feel, which describes the precision and fluidity you feel when you interact with the game world. This monitor has low input lag as well, which helps. I measured 1.6 milliseconds of input lag, so that's a nice low level. So when it comes to the pixel responses, a nice way of exploring these are pursuit photographs. There's an article on the website all about monitor responsiveness which covers this technique in more detail if you're interested. But what you can see here is the monitor running at various different refresh rates. There aren't any overdrive settings. It's an OLED monitor. As usual, overdrive isn't the thing which you need to worry about. So 60Hz, 120Hz, 144Hz. You can see that the object becomes narrower and more sharply focused as the refresh rate is increased. That's reflecting the decrease in perceived blur due to eye movement. With some of the fine details, strong pixel responses help, particularly the white notches there. If you look at the reference screen, the M27Q, also running at 144Hz, that isn't by any means an amazing monitor as far as IPS LCDs go in terms of responsiveness, but it's still pretty decent, and it's at a level which most people are very comfortable with, so anything beyond that is a bonus. And this QD OLED is certainly beyond that. So the white notches are clearer. They're not countable, but you'd really need a high refresh rate here to be able to see them more clearly. or you'd need a pixel strobing or strobe backlight black frame insertion mode, which this monitor does not support. But the segmentation of the UFO is actually very distinct to the eye, so the black lines are bolder than they appear in the image. And if you look behind the UFO, for the reference screen, you can see what I would describe as powdery trailing. Some of it's fairly bold just near the UFO as well. They're due to weaknesses in pixel responsiveness. There are no such weaknesses, no weaknesses at all that can be perceived on this ASUS QD OLED. You don't have to worry about any weaknesses in pixel responsiveness or any overshoot. So even for the transitions shown here in this scene, which many LCDs will struggle with to varying degrees, no powdery trailing due to slower than optimal pixel responses, no overshoot to worry about, just a visually flawless sample and hold 144Hz experience. Some of the competing models do have a high refresh rate, but the way ASUS has positioned this one is that they wanted to reduce the cost a little bit, whilst considering the kind of games that people are generally going to play with this. They're going to be immersive games, and with the 5120 by 1440 resolution, it's very demanding. Not quite as demanding as 4K UHD, but not miles away from that. So it is going to be very difficult to actually obtain a solid 144Hz, let alone beyond that. The monitor supports VRR, variable refresh rate technology. I've got the game running at 120 frames a second, and the monitor is matching that with its refresh rate, 120Hz. So it supports VRR via Adaptive Sync and also HDMI 2.1 VRR. So the whole host of VRR technology is supported. You can use AMD FreeSync and NVIDIA G-Sync compatible via both DisplayPort and HDMI. And HDMI 2.1 VRR can be used with the PS5, for example, which doesn't support Adaptive Sync, although as I mentioned earlier, this monitor is really primarily designed for PC gaming. VRR range of this one is claimed to be 48 to 144Hz. As usual though, sometimes it's more like 55Hz to 144Hz, depends on the fluctuations occurring, but that isn't something to worry about too much. The monitor employs LFC, low frame rate compensation, meaning that the refresh rate will stick to a multiple of the frame rate below that value. Something to be aware of, as it does use OLED technology, there is something called VRR flickering. So if there are heavy fluctuations in frame rate, that's not occurring right now, it's very stable, and with my RTX 3090 it doesn't happen too often, but there's certainly some scenes where it can happen. Then there are some slight gamma changes which you can observe for darker and some medium dark shades, so it can appear as a sort of brightness change for certain shades as the refresh rate fluctuates. And some people are quite sensitive to this and can find it a bit bothersome. It's something which I've noticed more strongly on VA models in general, VA LCDs. They often have issues with this. And really because of the exceptional contrast of OLED and the decent contrast of VA, these issues can be sort of unmasked, so to speak. But what I would say is the level of VRR flickering here is typical, in line with what I've seen with other OLED monitors which use Adaptive Sync or don't have an NVIDIA G-Sync module. The NVIDIA G-Sync module, the AW3423DW, slightly reduced the VRR flickering, but it was still there, and it can still bother some people either way. But I do know many people will happily use OLEDs even with this. They don't really mind too much, just some scenes, yes, there's a bit of flickering. It's not intense and bothersome flickering to most people, so it's not something I'd worry about necessarily, but if you are sensitive to it, it is something to be aware of. So overall, I enjoyed using this monitor, mainly for gaming. Immersive gameplay, really what it's all about for me, and that included some slightly competitive titles like Battlefield, as well as single-player story-driven games. You can use it for productivity, and I did use it for productivity. A few things to be aware of though. First of all, QD OLED technology. Burn-in is a concern, longer term. Shorter term image retention can be a concern. It's the same with any OLED technologies. There are some mitigation measures that the monitor includes, and you do have to just practice good OLED hygiene, so to speak. That is to say, you don't really want lots of static content on the screen for a long time if you can avoid it. So if you want to be using your monitor heavily for productivity, then really OLED isn't a good choice for you. The other thing with productivity in mind is I found because of the width of the screen, I was sitting a little bit further back than I'd usually sit for monitors, so I found 80 to 90 centimeters better than my usual 70 centimeters, because otherwise I had to move my neck all the time to see the sides of the screen, and that just didn't feel natural to me. But for the immersive gameplay, filling up the peripheral vision, it's actually really nice from even 70 centimeters. So it really just encompasses a lot of what I like about QD OLED technology: exceptional color performance, exceptional contrast performance, really lovely HDR. Another thing which some people will like about this monitor, of course, is the branding, the styling. It's not going to be to everyone's taste, but at least it's a little bit toned down compared to some of the ROG Swift offerings. There aren't any colourful elements. There's just a little light at the rear of the monitor, a little eye. And there is the little lighting feature in action at the rear, just cycling colours. You can't see that from the front, so it's bit gimmicky for most people. Responsiveness also exceptional, as I'd hope from an OLED monitor. 144Hz, but the reason they've done this is to try and keep costs down just a little bit. And with all of this in mind, I did say I enjoyed the experience, and I did, but it's kind of hard to weigh this up at the moment because I'm not sure exactly what the cost will be, but rumour has it was going to be around $1,500 US. I'm hoping it might be undercutting that a little bit. That's the RRP, as far as I've been told. I am hoping it can undercut its 240Hz competitors. Samsung has their own Odyssey model, and there's a Philips model as well. They support 240Hz refresh rates. But if you feel that 144Hz is sufficient, and if you're happy with the pricing of the monitor, I do think it's definitely worth considering. Another thing that's worth mentioning is the monitor doesn't include a cooling fan. It has a heatsink design, and as I understand it, that is unique to the Asus. So that's really all there is to this quick review of the Asus ROG Swift OLED PG49WCD. Be sure to check out the full video review. There's a link to that in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do. Be aware that liking the video, subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, they are nice ways of showing your support.